Hopefully, all of you can see that. I actually need to turn the recording on before I do anything else, don't I? Is it actually already record? Oh, it's already recording. Good. There we are. Didn't need to worry about that. Okay, so uh, 2 days until the big elections. Most of you will know this, but just as a recap of what is at stake, about 5,000 council seats in England across different local authorities. We'll have a particular focus on London in this presentation, but elections right across the UK. And in fact, we're just back from speaking to people in West Yorkshire and Calderdale, which I'll talk a little bit about as well, because that's likely to be one of those swing areas. We've got the elections for the Scottish Parliament, so 129 MSPs there, and elections for the Senedd as well under a completely new system and in an expanded Welsh Parliament. And I guess if I were to, based on all of our polling and our focus groups, try and sum up the mood of each of the elections. This is the coloured subtitles there are my best approximation of it. You know, in England, it really is that insurgent election. It is the total collapse of the traditional two-party system. It is people saying, I'm not happy with the status quo, that this alternation between Labour and Tory doesn't seem to be making any difference. It isn't making my life better. To go north of the border to Scotland, I've said this before, but the thing which struck me in Scottish focus groups was just how unenthusiastic people were about these elections. You know, this feeling, I call it meh, you know, this feeling of meh, we've got an unpopular incumbent government in Westminster, we've got a tired government in Holyrood. I would definitely say the most unenthusiastic I have seen people about an election in the time that I'm doing this. Normally, at least people are either motivated by getting someone else out or getting their party in. You just see very little of that in Scotland. Contrast that with Wales, though, where there is real, I mean, you know, sort of subheading for the Welsh Parliament elections is the change election. There is a real sense that this is going to be a moment of difference in Wales. And, you know, when it comes to that change wave, Labour obviously been particularly hurt by the fact that they've got that double incumbency. They're in power in Cardiff Bay and in Westminster at the moment. And as a result, the mood for change is sending their coalition, as I will show you, in all sorts of different directions. So I think, you know, the sort of sum up takeaway, if you weren't to stay for the rest of this webinar, which I hope you are, would be England, it's that insurgent election, Scotland, the meh election, and Wales, a change election. Just to give you some of the national context, obviously we are less than 2 years away from Labour having won a landslide election, but on a relatively small share of the vote. Their share of the vote is even smaller now. And one of the reasons that these elections look set to be very bad for Labour is unlike in a sort of traditional set of local elections where you tend to lose seats and votes in one direction. In this election, we are seeing Labour lose votes sort of left, literally left, right, and centre. So losing about 11% to Reform UK, similar amount to the Greens, a chunk who don't know, and then 6% each to the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. So a really fragmenting vote, very reminiscent of what we saw happen to the Tory vote. And I think what's interesting is, and what has really stuck with me through running focus groups in the run-up to these elections is how similar the diagnosis of voters who are going in very different directions, have very different political views, live in very different areas with different life circumstances are. It is across the board. It is this sense that the social contract is broken, that working hard, doing the right thing doesn't get you where it should do, and that other people are benefiting. And so for younger graduates, it's I've done the right thing, I've gone to university, and yet I'm saddled with debt. I can't get on the housing ladder. voters going to the Greens tend then to say that, that the uber rich are benefiting at their expense, but the core of their diagnosis is they've done the right thing and it's not paying off. Speak to voters going to reform, and it's almost exactly the same. They tend to be older, but it tends to be, I've sort of worked hard. I thought I'd be winding down. I thought I'd reached the kind of, golden years of my life, and yet I'm sort of working harder than ever. Whilst other people, and if, people going to the Greens tend to say it's billionaires taking advantage of the system. Those going to reform tend to say it's the benefit system disincentivizing work or our approach to immigration and asylum. So, the sort of the who is benefiting might be different, but the underlying diagnosis of a broken social contract is very much the same. It's also fair to say that despite these being local elections, I mean, I've already talked about national issues shaping them, international issues are shaping them as well. And the conflict in the Middle East, the Israel-US-Iran war, is very definitely shaping people's attitudes to these elections. Starmer does get some credit for his handling of Trump, but on the flip side, he was already facing a great deal of frustration for not being seen to do enough on the cost of living. Does this make things worse? For reform, I think there is no doubt from the conversations that we've been having that, and you see it in the polling too, it's the top hesitation about voting reform, that Nigel Farage's relationship with Donald Trump has become an anchor around the party. On top of that, you have this sense of sort of perma scandal. And I think the reason that this is so damaging to the government is less the specifics of any individual scandal that's happened, whether it's freebies or Angela Rayner's tax affairs or Mandelson, but just this broader sense of this was supposed to be something different. This was supposed to be something new, and yet it feels like a sort of continuation of the same. And I guess Joe from Newcastle kind of sums it up. The first thing I wanted when Labour came in was for Labour to establish trust again. A feeling that hasn't happened, and it's a sort of plague on all your houses, again driving that anti-incumbency mood. And it's fair to say as well that there is a significant chunk of the population who now sort of have almost given up. They're sort of checking out, that they perhaps see these elections or the next general election as a last roll of the dice to try and get something different. But particularly in the Qual, and again particularly in Scotland, that sense of this isn't working, and what is the point is really strong. You can see there that when you ask people how important these elections are, interestingly people are slightly more likely to say the English local elections are very important than they are the Scottish and Welsh Parliament elections. There, significant chunks saying not important. Interestingly, Reform UK voters in England and Wales, less so in Scotland, as I'll mention, are more likely than average to see these as important elections. How do the party leaders, how are they shaping this campaign? Well, I don't think I'm telling you anything particularly new. That Keir Starmer is very underwater. You can see there our leader approval graph there. He does get some credit, as I said, for his handling of Trump and navigating multiple crises. And from loyal Labour voters, so those who've voted for the party at the last election and are still voting for them, this sense he needs more time. But the pervasive criticism of Starmer is, number one, is weak, a sense that he doesn't have the strength to take on the challenges that the country faces, but also insincere and unwilling to stand behind his promises or policy platforms. If we then go further on these approvals, what you see is a sense that most people think it would be better if he was replaced. Although I don't actually, think that should be, I think that's current Labour voters rather than Labour 2024 voters. A sense that that they don't want to do that. If you do Labour 2024 voters, it's a little bit closer on that. If you do head to head, it is interesting. Andy Burnham does come out on top of Keir Starmer. Wes Streeting actually now, for the first time, actually it says tied there, but actually comes out ahead of the Prime Minister on that. But other figures, Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, come behind. So it's still that sense that there isn't quite a consensus of who should take over, certainly from within Parliament. Obviously, Andy Burnham's not in Parliament, is very much there. What about Kemi Badenoch? Well, this is, Kemi Badenoch is sort of almost one of the most interesting elements of the election in that there's starting to be a real disconnect between the Conservative Party vote share and Kemi Badenoch's personal approval ratings. So the Conservatives remain flat in focus groups, particularly in Wales and Scotland, but also some of England. They're almost seen as being off the pitch. And one voter I spoke to said, the thing with the Tories is they're irrelevant these days, which is quite a thing for a party which has traditionally been one of the most successful election-winning machines. And yet, Kemi Badenoch is now the least disapproved of the party leaders, with a net approval rating of -6. And that isn't actually, sometimes low net approval ratings are just because people don't know you. Actually, her personal, the number of people who say she's doing a good job now is as high as, almost as high as Farage's. She has fewer negatives. So when you speak to people in focus groups, there's this sense of people like the way that she takes Keir Starmer on, that she is authentic, she feels fresher for people. But as I say, and I think that quote from Tom in Halifax gets it, people just aren't willing to look at the Tories, or many people aren't willing to look at the Tories again after the last 14 years. Ed Davy's interesting. So, you do not get many people in focus groups who say negatives about Ed Davey, but again, if the Tories don't come up much unprompted, the Liberal Democrats, or even less so. And there is a sense that in a period when the Liberal Democrats, perhaps traditionally would have capitalized on discontent with the left-wing government, as they did during the 2000s, that perhaps Ed Davey has failed to do that. So again, it's not a negative view. And certainly if you chat to some people in areas where the Liberal Democrats do have pockets of strength, be it in the Blue Wall or places like Hull, where they're in a battle with Reform UK, there people do speak positively. But there is just a sense of, in a change moment, what change are the Liberal Democrats offering? And I think, after this set of elections, when, we expect the Liberal Democrats to gain seats, I think if they are going to compete with the insurgents, Reform, the Greens, they're going to have to work out a little bit more what their change is, what the difference they're offering is. Nigel Farage again is interesting in the sense that Reform are leading in the polls. We expect them to do very well in England, but also break through in Scotland, potentially be close to first place in Wales. He, perhaps more than any other leader, manages to embody that sense of he will shake things up, he will challenge the status quo. And yet you can see from that leader approval graph that the sort of steady decline, that actually in the autumn of last year, Nigel Farage's approvals were much higher than they were previously. So he went up following the general election, but then they dropped back down, and he's now at -16, which is, still in that kind of mid pack. But two things do seem to be damaging. The bigger issue, as I've already said, is Trump, but also you do get this thing now in more right-leaning focus groups, with almost that he's seen as having become part of the establishment. Will he actually do anything different? And whilst it is a small minority, he doesn't have huge name recognition. A couple of people in reform-facing focus groups who say, "Oh, is someone like Rupert Lowe actually, more credible Obviously more authentic. I wouldn't overblow that, as I say, but I think it definitely does pose a challenge to reform. What about Zach Polanski? So the Greens are going into this set of elections with, with real momentum, and it is interesting. You speak to. I talked about those, particularly sort of young graduates who are struggling in urban areas. There's no doubt that Polanski's Green Party offers them a sort of hope, and people talk in a hopeful way about the Greens. But you'll also see from that graph there that Polanski had, this week an almost, a really significant drop. He fell 14 points in his net approval rating over the past week. And from our focus group conversations, it seems like the Golders Green response, the subsequent retweet, apology, criticism from other political parties has very definitely cut through. It is also the case that there are some credibility challenges the Greens will have to address, and I do think that whilst it's sometimes dismissed as a sort of Westminstery focused or press story, there is no doubt from conversations that the hypnosis scandal, when people learn about it, it does give them sort of pause and question. And Polanski will want to, I think, do more to address that in the future. But as I said, there is no doubt he is reaching people, and I'd go as far as say inspiring people who have been, very frustrated and haven't felt represented up until now. If we look then specifically at the English local elections, if we look at the baseline, and it's obviously you've got to always take a pinch of salt with comparing local with national elections, but these are areas, the areas that are up, Labour did very well in at the general election. They had a bigger lead than they did in other parts of England. So in England, they led the Tories by 8. In the areas that have elections in England, they led by 14. Lots of the councils, and I think this is why it's seen as a sort of key test for the government, overlap with parliamentary seats that returned Labour MPs. So there is a sort of lot to lose in these elections, but we also don't expect them to be the only losers. If you look at our local elections voting and compare it with change from the general election, Labour way down, but the Tories still down, even from that very low result which we saw them achieve at the last general election, and the big gainers, Reform UK and the Greens. What do we think? And I always say take these with a pinch of salt, because there are so many factors which could shape things either way. But you are looking at Reform likely to be the big winners in seat changes in the night, followed by the Greens, the Liberal Democrats making some advances, maybe it's not as many as they would like. The Tories down again, even after last year's bad set of elections, they're going to be losing more seats. And Labour likely the big losers, somewhere around that 1,500 mark. And I think this is really interesting, is that if you look at the difference between different voters and their sort of level of optimism about their local area, there is now just a massive difference between particularly Labour and Reform voters at opposite ends of the spectrum, but Labour voters in general, and I think sometimes. Particularly you see it with sort of some commentators who are voting Labour. They almost can't understand the pervasive sense of national gloom, or why people have soured on Keir Starmer so quickly. And I think this chart actually, more than any other, helps to explain it. If you look at it, people who are voting Labour are much more likely to be optimistic about the fact their local area is improving, that their local council is going in the right direction, that it's making the best decisions in the best interests of residents. Reform voters are the total flip of that, and everyone else, just slightly, Lib Dems a bit in the middle, but just slightly on the left-hand side of the axis. So there's almost this kind of, it's an optimism divide in Britain at the moment. And I think, the challenge clearly for Keir Starmer and the government is that there are far fewer people. If we did those blobs in size of votes, it would show that there are fewer people on that optimistic end of the spectrum. I already mentioned that Reform voters are the most motivated. So if you look here, you can see, nearly two-thirds of Reform voters say that these elections are very important. Tory and Labour voters somewhere in between, Liberal Democrats and the Greens slightly less so, which might point to a change. And I think this, this gets to the heart of why these elections, when I talked about those seat projections, could be quite unpredictable because the harder thing to do in modeling local elections is not just how people are going to vote, but who they're going to vote for. And this graph is really telling. If you look at people who are 10 out of 10, certain to vote. Reform UK are ahead quite clearly there, followed by Labour, Tories, and Greens. If you go down to the people who are only 7 or lower likely to vote, the Greens lead, right? And so, what the Greens are going to have to do if they're going to be at the top end of expectations, is turn out voters who aren't that enthusiastic about these elections, don't normally vote. Lots of those will be younger voters. That's nothing new. But I think it does just show quite how, I mean, he's almost a sort of 45-degree line there on the Greens and turnout, and it could really hamper their prospects. If it is an election where basically, highly motivated people vote, then Reform UK stand to gain. What are they voting on? Council tax and potholes come top. That's fairly standard for elections like this. Interestingly, though, for both Green and Labour voters, it's actually housing that comes top. And I would say, look, housing's always been an important issue in politics. I think, thinking about recent focus groups, it hasn't come up as much unprompted as it has done in the past year or so. I think part of that actually, and this is anecdotal, but from the groups, is that I think some landlords behaving, well, depending on what you think of the Renters' Rights Act, either behaving badly or behaving preemptively, has meant that, there have been more people sort of being forced to move or accept new terms before the new legislation came in. But very definitely across the groups, lots of people talking about housing. Uh, and the truth is, look, if you ask people who are voting for Reform UK in particular, even though these are local elections, immigration is still important to them. When you ask people about whether the government's been too soft, too harsh, or about right on illegal immigration, people are more likely to say too soft. When you ask people about legal migration, it's split between too soft and about right, with a small minority who say too harsh there. And I think the interesting thing is it's often, I mean, you can see there is a difference between London and the rest of the country. But it isn't huge. It isn't perhaps as great as is sometimes portrayed there, particularly on if you look at the legal migration one. So, but again, in focus groups that we've been running around the country, migration has been coming up. Some races to watch in England. Hull is really interesting because this could well be a Reform Liberal Democrat battle. Reform won the Hull and East Yorkshire mayor last year. The Liberal Democrats currently have a majority on the council. It'll be interesting because we're not used to, I mean, Reform and the Liberal Democrats have sort of been acting as this pincer on the Conservatives, but largely in quite different areas. Actually, this is one where they face a kind of head to head, and it would be interesting to see if Reform can take some of the Liberal Democrats' mantle there. Birmingham is going to be sort of, I guess, the poster child for the electoral fragmentation that we expect to see in these elections. We expect to see Reform UK doing very well, but also Independents building on their general election success to do very well. The Greens there. Meanwhile, the Conservatives and Labour, who have traditionally been the largest parties in Birmingham, reduced to a very small number of seats. And it is interesting when you speak to people in Birmingham. Two things really jump out. One, this won't surprise anyone that follows Birmingham politics, the bin strikes. But more broadly, and particularly amongst Birmingham's Muslim community, a sense that Labour has taken Birmingham for granted and isn't doing enough either to stand up for particular communities within Birmingham or the city more widely. We've also been in Sefton ahead of these elections. Interesting because it's an area of Merseyside which has in the past had a bit of a conservative presence on the council. That's been really squeezed. Labour doing very well, but actually, if Reform UK are breaking through in Merseyside, it may well be, and certainly our MRP puts Reform and Labour neck and neck. It could be that we see this as being the start of Reform breaking through in an area which has traditionally been associated with the left and certainly not the right. And I think what we might be about to find out in Merseyside more broadly is that actually, rather than being an anti-right region, it was more of an anti-conservative region. In recent years, obviously, Merseyside does have a conservative past in the more distant past. And then Calderdale is really interesting because Calderdale is a council which is in West Yorkshire. One of the reasons we picked it to focus on was because it has such a range of different communities, places like Hebden Bridge, which is very liberal and might go green, places more sort of Leave voting but Labour areas in around North Halifax, a large Muslim community, again, traditionally Tory Labour battleground. They have all out elections, they're not electing in thirds. So what we could see is a very dramatic shift to Reform and the Greens there. And it's interesting. So again, we actually did 8 focus groups in Calderdale over the past 2 days. We only came back last night, and you really got from some of the comments from people in different communities in the council, just this sense of the sort of different things which are driving the different drivers of that rise of insurgency. So, that quote from Anushka in Solby Bridge, which is, we had the Conservatives who were consistently shit, whereas Labour is shit but faster. I think is actually quite a good way of summing up how lots of people think about the public mood. You've got some people driven towards the Greens, some people turning towards Reform UK. If we look at London specifically, what is driving people's vote in London? Policing and crime actually comes much higher. You can see potholes and quality of roads is lower than in the rest of the country. Affordable housing, again, high for Labour and the Greens. And I thought this was really interesting, was there is again, it goes to that kind of different perceptions of, the world and your community around you. If only Londoners who say they feel safe in London voted, then you would likely have Labour doing very well, followed by the Conservatives. If you only look at voters who say they feel unsafe in their local area in London, Reform do very well. But also, interestingly, the Greens do much better in areas where people say that they feel unsafe. So again, these outsider parties are doing much better in areas where people feel less safe. And I think that is really striking. It goes to a sort of difference, that sense of insecurity. And I think particularly on the Greens, it's sometimes assumed that, crime and antisocial behaviour is lower down Green voters' list of concerns. We don't find that at all in our focus groups that we look at. So our MLP for London, which is out today, and you can find the full details on our websites, basically suggests what we're going to see again is an explosion of electoral fragmentation, that traditionally safe boroughs for Labour, or at least safe in recent times, like Hackney, Islington, Newham, Lambeth, Lewisham, the Greens biting at Labour's heels, actually on top in the model in Hackney, Reform UK making gains in Bexley, Havering, Bromley, and Hillingdon. The Liberal Democrats potentially challenging Labour in Merton there. I think what will probably disappoint the Conservatives, and again, this is a projection or an estimate, it might well change, is on this model, they're not projected to top the poll in Westminster or Wandsworth, which was seen as potential bright spots again. And I'll go on to say lots of people, though, still making up their mind, and you can see there just that shift. That Labour goes from having absolute dominance in the capital to being, we think, under 30% of the vote. The Greens more than doubling their vote share in London. Reform UK up in an area where they traditionally haven't done as well. And if you look there at this graph, it really shows you it does show you that absolute dominance. Labour was above 40% in a whole swathe of London boroughs, two-thirds of them in 2022. We project that they are unlikely to pass 40% in a single London borough in these elections, which is, of course, a significant shift. That said, the heavy caveat we find is that there's a chunk of voters, around 1 in 5, and this is 1 in 5 likely voters, so not of the hope people who actually say they will go and vote, who say they haven't decided. Obviously, small shifts, particularly in an era of fragmentation, could change the outcome dramatically there. Scotland, I already talked about that lack of enthusiasm. Lots of Scots saying that things are getting worse in Scotland today, that there is an impatience for change, and yet there isn't a change candidate because you've got these two different incumbents. You've got the SNP and Labour in Westminster, the SNP in Holyrood, and that is driving people to, again, this quote from April, who's a unionist voter in North Berwick, says, I want the SNP to lose, but I don't know what a good outcome would be. And again, speak to nationalists, sometimes this sense of, well, yeah, the SNP are tired. They've always voted for them, but there's something, that they haven't got that excitement that they have. And you see that, again, I found it, striking, having nationalist voters saying, oh, you didn't agree with it, didn't like it, but I preferred it when you had people like Ruth Davidson, unionists saying people like Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, at least had, sort of sense of fire, even though I disagreed with them. And I think that sense that Scottish politics has sort of taken a step backwards is why this election is seen as so unexciting, underwhelming. And the fact that, 44% of the public select don't know, or none of them, as the best First Minister is telling. And, it is not that the Scottish government hasn't done things which are popular in lots of the times in existence, so things like the baby box, prescription charges, very popular, but overshadowed. And I think particularly the Sturgeon Murrell investigation, I was struck by how often it came up in focus group, particularly for people who had previously been fans of Nicola Sturgeon, sort of feeling let down, and this sense that it sort of typified that, since she'd gone, the SNP hadn't been able to find its groove. But Labour the same. And Labour, again, if you look at our implied voting intention from MRP, potentially heading for their worst results since devolution. If you look back to the general election, it looked like they were picking up support. Interestingly, whilst I said that Reform voters in England and Wales were more likely to say these elections are very important, in Scotland, actually, they're just less likely than the average voter to say that they're important. And it does seem, I do not, from the conversations in focus groups, what you see in the polling, I do not think the offered leadership has been the success and the sort of change driver that Reform might have hoped so. We still expect them to do very well, as our MRP shows, but I do think, in Scotland more than anywhere else, you do get about offered this, why would they make a Tory Lord leader of the party? And we can see there that the comments about the boat seem to reflect negatively on him. Sorry, apologies, the blue is negative here and the red is positive, but you can see there that most people or close to a majority, 44% saying their comments reflect negatively, just 23 positively. But interestingly, not that positive about Ross Greer's response either. 26% saying his response reflects positively, and 36% saying that it reflects negatively on him. So I don't think anyone coming out particularly that well. And you can see there's two different quotes from Rutherglen, which show different responses to the comments about the votes in the STV debate. And so it leads you to this sense that re-electing the SNP is seen as their least bad outcome rather than a particularly good one. So you get 33% saying that an SNP majority would be a good outcome. That's not far off their vote share. Still more saying it's a bad outcome, yet more so saying positive than any other outcome. How does that play out in our MRP? So the SNP benefiting from that fragmentation on the unionist side. The SNP, we estimate, would win 60 of 129 seats, 5 short of what they need for a majority there, with the Greens and Liberal Democrats making gains, but Reform UK making the biggest gains and potentially ending up in second place. And you see that there, Reform shooting up on that graph from 0 to 22 seats in that model. Labour falling potentially at risk of losing all of their constituency seats, even somewhere like Dumbarton, which they've held since devolution. Part of what is driving that is this sort of sense of fragmentation on the unionist side of the vote. So it's actually possible that more people vote for unionist parties in this election than have voted actually for quite some time, maybe since actually the start of devolution, 60% of the vote to parties which are pro-union. And yet, because it is more fragmented, the SNP benefiting there. Many constituencies still very marginal. Small swings could either put the SNP in majority position or make them much more precarious. And again, a similar number actually to London of voters who are undecided in Scotland as well. So again, if these, how this 18% vote will ultimately shape the course of that election. Finally, last but not least, arguably the most seismic actually of the elections in Wales, Reform UK very much driven by a sense that Wales isn't working at the moment, that the country doesn't work for ordinary people. Interestingly, that Welsh Reform voters are actually much more likely to cite the NHS as a worry, significantly more likely than English Reform voters there, but also issues like immigration topping the list. But also a significant amount of momentum behind Plaid, who are really seen as carrying that change mantle. And in focus groups, there is actually, unlike in some of the other elections, like genuine excitement about what Plaid might have to offer. This sense that they will put Wales first, that they will carve out a distinctive voice. And again, you often people saying, "Oh, I want Wales to be a bit more like Scotland in terms of how it stands up for itself." There, and also for progressives, an alternative to reform. It is much less a vote for independence, a vote for Plaid, than a vote for the SNP is, and you really hear that in the focus groups where people say, well, we're not particularly talking here about independence. We just want someone who will stand up for us more, who also, perhaps won't take us for granted. I think the double incumbency reinforces a sense that Labour has taken Wales for granted. And that combination of anger at Labour, but also worries about reform, has sort of almost de-risked Plaid. Previously, people might have said Plaid, they're nice, but can they form government? Actually, if you look there, the clear, plurality, 42% saying that Plaid would be ready to form a government if they won in Wales. That is much more than Save for Reform. Given Welsh Labour are in government, we didn't ask if they'd be ready, but asked if they were fit to govern Wales. And it is a much smaller group there. And you see, I mean, this is really striking that so much of Plaid's vote, nearly 4 in 10 Plaid voters, are people who voted Labour at the last general election. And what that has done is, and I've shown this before, but I think it's useful to show it again, is what it's meant is that the nature of Plaid voters has changed. Plaid has gone from the median Plaid voter would have put themselves at a 5 out of 10 on the left-right scale previously. They're now at a 4 out of 10, which might not sound like much, but given most people align towards the centre, that's quite a significant shift. They've become, in their voter base, a much more of a vehicle for disillusioned progressives than Plaid has been previously. Where does that leave you with? Well, our final Welsh MRP has Plaid and Reform UK tied on 34 seats each. Plaid are ahead in the vote share, but the distribution of votes of the seats means that they come out tied. And Welsh Labour down significantly since our last MRP. It does seem like the Caerphilly effect, where they were squeezed between Reform and Plaid, is happening again in these elections. The Tories way down on 9 seats, and the Greens breaking through into the Senedd. What that would mean, and look, lots of these seats are on a knife edge, so it could change, but actually even Plaid and Labour on that model would be short of the seats needed for a majority. You would need the Greens support as well there. And there is a risk. I mean, I think there's a reason why Plaid have been so hesitant, or have actually said that they would prefer a minority government, because there is no doubt that there are some voters who say that a coalition would be a bad outcome. So, only 3 in 5 Plaid supporters think a Plaid Labour coalition would be a good outcome. 1 in 5 say it would be bad. Still, a clear majority one way, but that's way down from Plaid as a majority. And I think there's a risk of Plaid becoming seen as a vehicle for continuity. Labour on track for their worst result in Wales in history, which is kind of extraordinary. And I expect a lot of the focus to be on that shift in Wales after the election. But again, lots of seats open to small changes in support, particularly the 6 seat. The nature of the electoral system in Wales means that small shifts really affect how that 6 seat in each of the constituency goes. And you can see that range for Plaid and Reform there, depending on how some of those 5th or 6th seats go. We have Eluned Morgan, as I put on the previous slide, failing to win a seat by 0.2% of the vote. So it really is very much all to play for. On where those seats break will decide the ultimate composition of the Welsh government. We have about 15 minutes now left for any questions.